listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Strayhuber. Let's get ready to go against the grain. We have an awesome show for you today. Starting off, we'll get into political posturing of the Trump administration and the Democratic Party as we have an election scheduled in the middle of a pandemic. I'll discuss the fallout of that contest. For the rest of us, it will not be good. A little later, we have a fascinating discussion on China and the decreasing level of animosity from the people of the United States as they blame China for the viral outbreak. This, of course, has international repercussions as the incentives of the domestic policy drive political parties to outflank one another on scapegoating the country, something that will inevitably lead to an overt conflict. To discuss, we have author Danny Haifeng. Later in the hour, we'll discuss the concerns and the stinging advice the 2008 Obama's campaign team had for one habitual liar, Joe Biden. And again, I say that as a flat fact. He dropped out of his campaign in the 80s or 90s for lying about civil rights, his education, and stealing speeches. So brutal, yes, but also correct. Also, tangential to Biden, the Big O himself has emerged from the shadows, not winded in the least from pushing Bernie Sanders out of the race. Obama bashed Senate Republicans for investigating Joe Biden and his kids' murky ties with the Ukraine. For God's sakes, Joe Biden danced on stage screaming that he got a prosecutor fired from the Ukraine. And by the way, he lied in telling that story. It took months, not hours. He lied entirely for the theatrical effect in that moment. Also, a drug addict, his kid, without the slightest bit of experience in oil and gas or the Ukraine, gets a job making $80K a month. Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing to see here at all. If that's not enough, we have a second full hour. The lawsuit Yang brought against New York succeeded. The New York primary is back on. Bernie is back on the ballot. Yay, yay. I spoke my piece about that at 4 in the morning, so I won't necessarily repeat. Now, this is not set in stone. That particular verdict can be appealed, but for right now, get your IDs ready for the voting in New York. We'll also discuss presidential candidate, the invisible man, Joe Biden, Lift Every Voice plan, a plan targeted, supposedly, at African Americans. I'm always enamored by the naming of these plans and the singling out blacks as if they don't need health care or housing or elimination of student debt or increased wages, as if those things won't dramatically affect the people at the bottom of the income bracket, many of which, disproportionately so, are black. But okay, we'll go through Joe Biden's Negro plan and we'll see what Joe Biden got. Last but not least, it is hump day. That means one thing, revelations. We have the terrifying revelations and another potentially terrifying revelations with a bit of chest thumping on my part. I'll let Bob decide the order, but you don't want to miss it. But right now, let's start here. Donald Trump is withdrawing and winding down the Corona Taskforce as early as this month. This is what Pence said. Let's play the clip. Trump winds down task force.
I think that as far as the task force, Mike Pence and the task force have done a great job, but we're now looking at a little bit of a different form, and that form is safety and opening, and we'll have a different group probably set up for that.
Are you saying mission accomplished?
No, not at all. The mission accomplished is when it's over. When it's over, Jim, mission accomplished mostly. And I just said it today. I used the word for the first time, I think, in terms of what we're doing. I'm viewing our great citizens of this country, to a certain extent and to a large extent, as warriors. They're warriors. We can't keep our country closed. We have to open our country. Well, now it's time to open it up. And you know what? The people of our country are warriors, and I'm looking at it. I'm not saying anything is perfect. And yes, will some people be affected? Yes. Will some people be affected badly? Yes. But we have to get our country open, and we have to get it open soon.
People will die. But we got to get our country open. They're warriors. We can't hold them back. They're warriors. The American public just wants to get out there. 70% of the American public said don't open it up. That they were terrified of going out and would preferred for these businesses and companies to stay closed because they were more concerned about getting the virus. Yes, supermarkets they were okay with, but that's a risk analysis. You still got to get food, so they were willing to make that leap, but not opening it up. They were very clear on that. And yet, this is the policy that Donald Trump is going with. Reuters yesterday reported that the death toll is going to be revised upward, effectively doubling. We're at over 70,000 people dead now. Over 1 million infected. And that number is only continuing to go up. Now, Donald Trump is telling people, we need you to get back to work, literally in the middle of a pandemic that is utterly out of control. Governor Abbott in Texas, who is one of these guys who also wants to open it up, gets caught on a hype mic. Let's hear Governor Abbott.
How do we know reopening businesses won't result in faster spread or more cases of COVID-19? Listen, the fact of the matter is pretty much every scientific and medical report shows that whenever you have a reopening, whether you want to call it a reopening of business or just a reopening of society in the aftermath of something like this, that actually will lead to an increase in spreads. It's almost ipso facto. The more that you have people out there, the greater the possibility there is for transmission.
They accept that. They accept that. Understand what I'm saying? In order to get the economy open, they're willing to put human lives on the line, and they accept that those humans will die as a result of the actions that they're taking. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? Now imagine for the moment you're a politician. Let's say you're running in a presidential race. And as you're running in the presidential race, you come to the conclusion, you sit in with your advisors, all of you guys are there, and one guy says, look, you have several problems. And in having several problems, you have economy that's collapsing, you have people that are ill that are dying, you have pandemic rates that are going up, and you're running in the middle of a presidential election, meaning anything that you do is going to be used against you. And Trump says, well, how do I win? How do I get out this? One of the guys in the room stands up and says, look, if you give everybody health care, everybody that has coronavirus, free health care, you also ensure that those people are covered and make sure that those small businesses don't collapse. If you do that, I guarantee you would win. And everybody in the room laughs. All of them laugh. And then when they laugh like this, one guy sits up and says, all right, let's get serious. And he looks at Trump, he says, look, it's not your fault that there is a division in regards to politics in our country that breaks down along racial lines. You have African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, you have all that groups over there. And you have the majority of the people who are white. And that majority of the people, for the most part, is in the Republican Party. And you have different reasons for the reasons those people are in the party, but nevertheless, they're in the party. Now, in being in the party, he tells you, your party, the Republican Party, has certain ideological biases that you can use. The $1,200 that you sent them, many of them would accept that as government help, and they would want to get back to work, even if that means they may get ill, because for them, they think it's pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you go out there and make a living for yourself, not understanding that government can be more than that, in which case they're ideologically rigid. It's great for that. But also, that group who's okay with working, that group believes you more than many of the other groups. Now, Dr. Fauci and many of these other guys there believe, yes, but you're their president. And the Republican Party is backing you to the hill of 90%. And again, this group, we're not all affected evenly. So the people who are supporting you and the people who are backing you, those people, some of which may want to go to work, many of which want to stay home. But if they do go out, from the standpoint of the people that will get ill and sick and injured, it will be less of them and more of the other group. To put this in perspective, which I'm pretty sure Trump knows, this is a site called APM, Lab Research. For each 100,000 Americans, 37.2 blacks have died, along with 16.0 Asians, 15.9 Latinos, and 14.3 whites. In Kansas and Wisconsin, black residents are 7 times more likely to die than white residents in Washington, D.C. The rate among blacks is 6 times higher than whites, while in Michigan and Missouri it's 5 times greater. In Arkansas, Illinois, Louisiana, New York State, Oregon, and South Carolina, blacks are 3 to 4 times more likely to die of the virus. Black mortality rate was 28 deaths per 100,000, but rising of deaths has increased. Reporting has swelled the rate to 37. Mortality rates for groups has risen, and the virus has claimed more Americans as coast to coast, but black American death rates continue to rise faster than other groups. In New York, Michigan, Connecticut, and New Jersey, more than 1 in 1,000 black residents have died of COVID. In New York, the rate is approaching 2 out of every 1,000 black residents in the state. In New York, more than 1 in 1,000 Latinos. In this case, whites don't really apply to that because the number is so small. Collectively, black Americans represent 13% of the population in proportion to Americans, but represent 37% of the death rates. To put that in perspective, if black Americans had died of COVID-19 at the same rate as whites, about 9,000, the nearly 15,000 black residents who have died in these states would still be alive. My point is that basically the Trump administration understands that the people who are going to be affected are going to be disproportionately on the other side of the political aisle and would not vote for Trump anyway. The people who are on this side, the right side of the political aisle, basically are all in with Trump. Many of them actually believe the notion that the virus is not as bad as people say it is, not necessarily believe in the science, and is okay with going back to work because they also believe that the lion's share of the illness will not affect them as dramatically as it will affect the other group. This is the politics that Trump is using here, and this is the politics. This is the reason why he's winding down this task force and opening up the economy. He knows the Democrats are going to attack him on the economy. He wants to get it up and running. By the same token, he knows politically he is less hurt by this. Bob, what do you think of this? Is that too cynical? Where I'm thinking he knows the racial breakdown of this, and he knows that blacks are dramatically more affected than whites in this, so let's open the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the math on that is right. I don't think Republicans were doing much to address any issues of poverty in the United States, especially not for Latinos or for blacks. So this isn't necessarily a new decision. I think they've made this decision for quite a while. They've continued to crush workers' rights and not address inadequate health care in all of these communities. I think the math that you have wrong, or maybe Trump has wrong, is that I do think it's going to impact them. We're seeing a shocking number of deaths in senior homes and
That's right.
Older people's homes across the country. Older voters turn out and vote, and a lot of those voters are Republicans.
That's right.
And I think that needs to be mentioned. And so I guess I don't think his strategy on this note is all that strong of a strategy. I think for me, it's more about the economics and the own desire for the Trump administration to enrich themselves. And as much as obviously that allows them to win elections, I think it's more about the money than necessarily the politics. And I think that's why you'll see him make this calculus that's not necessarily bettering his electoral chances, but will definitely allow them to continue to make money and continue to siphon funds. I think the other thing that I would just make mention of with the percentages of white folks that aren't going to be impacted, a lot of those folks are Democrats as well. And I think that's why the Democratic Party has also not gone as deep as they needed to for workers and for low-income individuals across the country. I think they're also placating the wealthier, middle class, upper class white folks who have been able to keep their jobs, or at least can get through because they have enough family support, or they're able to get through because they have savings, which is a foreign concept to many poor communities across the country. So I think that's also one of the reasons that we need to look at why the Democrats have been so slow, because they too aren't necessarily driven by low income voters of color as much as the rhetoric may say that they are.
Yeah, I think that's it in part. I guess I'm thinking of this. Trump wants to start the economy back up. The owner class is pushing on the Republican Party every bit as much as it pushes on the Democratic Party. And in the context of, the Democratic Party standing by and allow Trump to do that, I honestly do believe that if this was one of those things that was hitting his community base more so, and keep in mind, it's not always just the reality of it, it's also the optics of it, meaning when reports come out showing, like this, where you have like the racial breakdown.
What hits his community? I don't know what it would hit their community though, because whatever hits them, they'll never actually blame Trump for it. I mean, I think it is Trump could walk in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot them, and they'll still forgive Donald Trump. Like, I don't think there's anything that could potentially hurt them, and so that's why Donald Trump always can just basically roll these folks out because they'll back in no matter what. Jamal, we have a lot to talk about, including how Donald Trump is going to fare through this COVID-19 thing. We have a big story about a whistleblower there coming out of the administration talking about the handling of 1-hydroxychloroquine, which Donald Trump was pushing as a miracle drug. We'll get to that in our first hour, as well as we're talking about Barack Obama rushing to help Joe Biden get all of the skeletons, trying to get the skeletons back into the closet. And we'll take a look at the latest efforts for the U.S. to scapegoat China for the COVID-19 pandemic. And don't worry if that's not enough for you. We'll have a second hour of Political Misfits after that. You listen to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Hey guys, you can talk back to me right now. We have like 40 seconds. Are we skipping AOC clip, which was going to be next?
Yeah,
we are above all the latest development.
I got you. So definitely.
Is Danny here?
Yeah, he's here.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian. Commentary and political analysis. What's really behind political and social crime?
I got you. So we'll just play by the ear. We'll make it work. It's all good.
We bring you independent experts, analysts, and
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my wingman, Bob Schlehuber. Let's get ready let's continue to go against the grain. Let's go that way. So I'm excited about this segment. A light goes off in my head every time we're discussing international politics, especially when there's political tensions. I am sick in that way. One of those international relationships that was already tense due to the trade war just got worse due to the pandemic slamming into the United States. Of course, I'm speaking of China. That has affected the perspective of American publics towards that country. To put some numbers to it, Pew Research found that nearly 2/3 of Americans have a negative opinion of China, with only a quarter having a favorable opinion. This is the highest negative percentage since Pew started asking this question. The negative opinion of China creates an open lane for both political parties to try to outflank one another in their rhetoric in blaming China for our own unpreparedness. Trump went as far as claiming, against prevailing opinion, that the virus originated in a lab, not through natural transmission. Let's hear the clip of Trump blaming Wuhan lab.
And my question is, have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have.
And what gives you a high degree of confidence that this originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that.
Do you think that withholding information about the virus is related to them trying to undermine your reelection?
No, I don't want to cast any dispersions. I just will tell you that China would like to see sleepy Joe Biden. They would take this country for a ride like you've never seen before.
Are you insinuating they intentionally let it spread?
Well, they could have done it, and I'm just saying, well, one of two things happened. They either didn't do it, and they couldn't do it from a competent standpoint, or they let it spread.
Either they were incompetent or they let it spread. That is such a weird way to put it. And of course, there's a pandemic, so you totally tied into your re-election campaign. I would like to bring on our guest because this genuinely concerns me. The other day when I heard the story, my first thought was, wow, that's going to create complications going forward. We're joined by Danny Haifong, activist, writer, and political analyst, and co-author of The American Exceptionalism and The American Innocence, a people's history of fake news from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me so much.
No, thank you for coming on. So, Danny, my concern was that domestic politics influences international relations, particularly during the election campaign when winning takes priority over pretty much everything else. If that means blaming China for our failure, tying your opponent to a country that is unpopular, or one of them jumping the shark and promising some sort of consequence to show how muscular they are in the face of China. A public that is soured to the degree that we have would allow a certain degree of bellicosity in this relationship. This also increases the likelihood of conflict in other areas like the South China Sea, as the country, again, will tolerate more belligerence against the country that the population doesn't like. So a report comes out from the Ministry of State Security saying that the global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. As a result, Beijing faces a wave of anti-China sentiment led by the United States in the aftermath of the pandemic and needs to be prepared in a worst-case scenario for armed confrontation between the two global powers. Well, that raised an eyebrow. Now, is my analysis of this misplaced in concern regarding the relationship between the two countries and how local or domestic sentiments can translate into these kind of conflicts between two nations in other areas other than the very specific issue of the pandemic?
Oh, it's not misplaced. There are definitely two elements to this. There is the fact that at baseline, the United States has created a strategy, especially the middle portion of the Obama administration when the pivot to Asia was announced, that there was this already existing hostility that was materialized in the buildup of military armaments and naval to China's border. Right now, over 50% of all U.S. military assets and over 60% of the U.S. Navy stationed in the Pacific, and that the Trump administration, James Mattis, when he was in the administration, announced that this Asia would continue and that the national security strategy of the United States included great power competition with China, and that's part of its overall military strategy. So there's at baseline this hostility. How the United States, in both a political crisis and economic crisis and the crisis of legitimacy, the pandemic has exposed all of the ills of U.S. capitalism and of the inadequacies of the system. And it is also an election period, so you're 100% correct on that. And we've seen this before. We saw right after George W. Bush was elected, his legitimacy was very hurt in all the rumors, and basically the proof that the election was a stolen one. When 9/11 happened, he used that as a way to engineer war in order to boost his popularity. We're seeing basically the same strategy being used by the Trump administration in a time that I think the Trump administration was not expecting. It was hoping to ride the wave of so-called economic stability, and all of that has been burst asunder by the pandemic. And China is a perfect target because the Trump administration knows the Democratic Party will take the bait and that it can flank to the right on the Democratic Party on China, regardless of how much the Democratic Party tries to appease right-wing forces in the United States on that question.
You know, the thing that concerned me the most was, if you say the virus is from Wuhan, and if you make this argument that China engineered the virus. Now, we had a guest on the other day that made the point that all of these nations work at this particular lab because there are so few of these labs in the world that it's kind of intermingled, meaning it's not necessarily just China, it's also multiple nations. And however, even if it got out of the lab, or for that matter, if it was a natural transmission, to say that they did it, and to even take the limit of saying they did it on purpose, it makes it possible politically, because you've just formalized a point of view from your country, speaking from your government, that they have done something to us. Now, Trump is using that to cover himself politically because he was so incompetent in the way he didn't necessarily deal with the virus. Also, the World Health Organization, we have people in the World Health Organization, meaning Trump was getting numbers immediately. So he's not being honest with it. But whether he's honest with it is less relevant than the politics. Because if he's formalizing this notion that China did something responsible, then it is very possible for Trump to also go right along with it and say, we need to get concessions or sanctions out of China for doing X or Y. And that's the thing that weirded me out, because at that point, China is going to balk at anything the United States says on that front, creating a conflict between the two nations.
Yes, the entire ruling class is trying to bait China into a broader war. That's what it has been trying to do for years. now the stakes are much higher because the United States has a lot that it needs to hide. Interesting is that U.S. public opinion is being swayed on this question. You cited the numbers of 2/3 of people in the United States have a negative view of China, and that's now materializing in these sort of bumped up, trumped up lawsuits that are being filed by entire states, like in Missouri, or by individuals who are claiming these accusations about China releasing the virus through a lab are legitimate, and thus reparations are questioned and in need of being pursued. So all of this is very troubling, and I think it speaks to just how desperate the United States has become to save face in the midst of this crisis, that they don't have any solutions. The time has already passed for the United States to respond to this adequately. There is time to, of course, reduce the impact of the virus, even though it's been so damaging overall. However, that would require a pretty deep intervention on the part of the government, investment in the needs of the people, and also an acknowledgement that a capitalist enterprise just can't continue with business as usual. And that's just not something that either political party is willing to consider. Trump is trying to use China as a distraction from these real pressing needs.
You know, Danny, last night, serendipitously, I was watching season 5 of Veep, and in the episode, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, the main character, tweets accidentally a direct message to all of her followers from the presidential account that she's on at the time. Spoiler alert there. But in the message, she basically tweets a very offensive joke about the person running against her for office, and basically to cover their tracks, they blamed the Chinese who had earlier that day hacked into the White House. And so they basically said it was the Chinese. And so Veep's making a joke about how they scapegoat China constantly. But then in the episode, because they needed to basically save face, well, what's the retaliation you do if China hacks the president's Twitter account? Well, you have to do something. And so then they announced sanctions. And so with all of this rhetoric, at some point you have to follow it up with actual policy that is very detrimental. So it's one thing for Trump just to cast blame and distract people, but it's another thing that when he actually starts putting on sanctions or has a trade war that's leading to horrible conditions for farmers across America, those things are actually real. And it seems like they're willing to go down these paths to spin stories, even if it actually has a repercussion that is unattended in that initial moment.
Of course. Generally, U.S. policy towards China is a disaster because not only is it an attack on probably the most globalized society in the world right now. China has connections to the entire world. Its economy is on the rise. There's so much damage that is just done to the world situation through attacks on China. And it places us in a very dangerous situation where the U.S. government has used weapons in the past. The U.S. government has used very damaging sanctions over 30 countries around the world. And then you have this trade war that seemed like it was easing for a bit. Now China is wholly prepared for that to continue. But on the other hand, while China is organized completely differently and can often take blows to by the United States in this way, that both its economic growth and its overall trajectory is not really off course. Whatever the United States is short of outright military aggression, in the United States, really workers who do suffer from this kind of belligerence, not only because it feeds the war machine even more surplus value from workers, but also, yes, are these unintended consequences of these policies, that being a form of economic blowback. The trade war was a perfect example of that. That's why you had even leading capitalist enterprises opposed to it, because not have any overall benefit other than political grandstanding for the Trump administration or the ruling elite. In any policy towards China, the ruling elite has to benefit the ruling elite if it's going to be effective for them. And that's what made opposition to the trade war so almost unprecedented, but also what makes this moment so dangerous, because it seems like all of the cards are on the table. that these crises aren't going away. You have this now. For sure, the United organized as a completely decrepit capitalist society that doesn't have any solutions out of crises. More are coming, and that only feeds this tool. It only fuels a conflict towards China even more.
Danny, I got a question for you. Do you know what Thucydides' trap is? Basically, two opposing powers. When there's an upcoming power and there's an established power, there's always a friction between the two, where the established power wants to maintain its position. And it creates a conflict almost just by definition of the way the powers are interacting with one another. It's this argument about China, basically, with the United States being established power and China being somewhat of an upcoming power, especially from the economic front and the technological front. And it creates a friction between these two just by definition of the way these two countries engage. China would argue we have every right to expand just as much as you did. And the United States, of course, trying to maintain its station, would balk at the notion of its expansion. And everything else that we've seen in regards to the friction between these two countries basically originates from that. This notion that the United States want to maintain its standing and advantage, whereas China wants to expand and expand to its natural ability to expand, which of course is a lot because all of the production, or a lot of the production power of the world at this point, is in China. What is that accurate in the way of looking at this? Meaning all of the other issues, be it trade war, be it this blaming of the pandemic, be it the politics of narratives that go forward, like China stealing our property and those type of things, all of those things basically boil down to geopolitics between countries that are trying to either maintain their station or expand into a stronger dominant position.
It's very accurate. One I would add is that not only is China a rising competitor to the United States' global share of the overall world economy, in that China is so rapidly growing economically that it, in many ways, will pass the United States in not many more years than a decade. But China also is an alternative model the United States offers around the world, meaning that even if China is very open towards relations with the United States. It wants a peaceful relationship. It wants peaceful competition between the United States and China. You can find this all throughout just the policy and as well as the statements of major Chinese officials. But that is the orientation. It's not we're overtaking you so you can become, irrelevant in the world and that we can kind of put our foot on you. It's really an idea that collaboration could actually work and foster competition for the benefit of all. However, the United States sees it much differently. The United States understands that China has an economic model. It is based on cooperation and is also based on interference, multipolarity, the idea that there should be multiple powers in the world that have influence over what goes on in the international arena. And also the fact that as China has been opening up and allowing the market into its own economy, it hasn't been a subservient partner, United States, meaning that it does not bow down to US's economic model, and actually standards of living in China and the standard of living of all people who have relations with China generally improves based on that relationship. That's not what the United States wants. The United States.
Danny, let me interrupt you for one moment on that, because that's a fascinating thing that I don't think most Americans get. Like when we have when we do stuff around the world, be it Western powers, the Brits, or whatever, those things don't just fade away and vanish. Like people remember that stuff. That stuff hurts. Like if you put pain on somebody, that pain doesn't just stop with the people who you put that pain on. That stuff wrinkles through generations. And I had this awesome conversations with this woman for a few hours, a Chinese woman, and she was making this point. Like she was basically saying, I knew about like the Boxer Rebellion and how the governments of China accepted that as almost a national disgrace of sorts and refused to ever let that happen again. But also, as she was saying, and she was describing her idea of the world, that basically countries being able to work together and so forth. And I said, well, that's not the way the United States looks at the world. She was like, what do you mean? I said the United States looks at the world as almost a chessboard, pretending the people not on it, and they have resources and they have alliances, they have people and domains that they want to control. That's the way we look at the world. And she was like, wow, I can't believe that you look at the world that way. And I was sitting there like shocked that she looks at the world that way. You know what I mean? Is China's system and the way they look at their expansion, is it not in that militaristic or domination way? I mean, is it more of a cooperative? Is that what you're trying to describe?
Yes, from Deng Xiaoping to Mao Zedong and all of the major Chinese officials that have guided policy on the basis of the state plan have all talked about China as a non-hegemonic power, that it is not about hegemony. There is no interest, and this is why only military bases that China really has around the world, even in a place like Djibouti in Africa, is a response to military aggression by the United States in the development of AFRICOM. And much of China's economic activity around the world is based on the idea that if you will cooperate with us and things that we need, we'll give you some things that we have that you need. Mutual cooperation, idea that and it needs a lot of resources, natural resources, to keep up its productive economy. And a lot of countries around the world need infrastructure because of the underdevelopment that imperialism has placed them under for so many decades. And so that arrangement honestly works in a lot of ways. And China will work with anybody. It works with socialist countries. It works with capitalist countries. It works with every country in between. That is how China has operated. And there's been so many slanders and lies about how China operates around the world that just mimic the CIA's talking points. It mimics the corporate media's talking points about China. But really, the history tells the tale that China has been developing strong relationships with countries for decades, and not one war has been started by China. There hasn't been any example of China undermining political processes in the way that the United States does, because China doesn't have an interest in that. It has an interest in maintaining its own stability and growth, and it sees the growth of countries as completely tied to that.
Yeah. Danny, I was also kind of curious if we just have a few minutes left here for you to talk a little bit about the book you co-authored there, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. We've talked a lot on this show about the process of conditioning Americans into thinking certain things are possible and what are not possible. And we talk on the domestic front all the time of folks saying, yes, we would love free healthcare, we would love college debt forgiveness, but we can't have those things. We can't just print money magically, even though in the last 8 weeks we've seen historical printing magic money happen. And then internationally, I'm always amazed too, Danny, where you have, I think, something like the killing of General Soleimani there, the Iranian general, and all these people saying, yeah, I was for it. Yeah. But then you say to people, well, do you feel like you're more safe now? They're like, oh, no, definitely not more safe. Definitely not. So it's like, well, what's the whole point of all of this, Danny? And I guess I'm curious from your book, tell us a little bit about the book and maybe what you found the most compelling or surprising when it came to actual how people in this country have been conditioned to see themselves at home and abroad.
Sure. So the book is an examination of the ideology of American exceptionalism and its very close partner, American innocence, meaning that this ideology that the United States is a force for good in the world, most civilized and advanced society, and that regardless of the crimes that it commits, even when criticisms are leveled at the United States, that somehow its intentions were good and that the values it was operating under ultimately justify everything that it does, both domestically and around the world. And I think the biggest that we found was just how pervasive these ideologies are, that regardless of partisan politics, regardless of it's Democrat or Republican, that there are forms that this narrative takes in order to just justify the same ends. Whether you're looking at what happened in Charlottesville, you had Donald Trump saying that these Unite the Right protesters, if you take away Robert E. Lee's statue, you got to take Thomas Jefferson and George Washington's statue as well because they were slave owners, and how liberals, and that is absolutely ridiculous. How dare you, fight? How dare you question the sanctity of the founding fathers? Or whether you have people like Paul Krugman who talk about how the United States became a benevolent empire for World War II. Unlike the Union and unlike Germany, the Nazis in Germany, that there was a real basis for empire on the grounds of democratic expansion and bringing so many benefits to the world, that really isn't a political faction in the elite that questions this, and it has such a big impact on how Americans view world affairs and their own domestic affairs. Because one thing that I found just really pertinent about our book was that, and it so much to what's going on with China, going on in terms of all the scapegoating that happened with Russia, all of this speaks to how much otherizing a country, a nation, a people is so embedded in the history of the United States, so embedded in all of the policies that ultimately produced by this imperialist nation, that it is very convincing. And no matter how bad things get under this liberal capitalist and imperialist order, the ruling class very effectively blames other countries for these problems and shows people, well, mainly lies to them about how awful things are around the world, in order to not only demonize those folks that are living in those conditions, but also to say, well, things could always be worse. And I think that at the end of the day, whether it's shipping jobs out to China and how wages were there for a time, all of the narratives that we hear about other countries around the world just helps fuel this idea that, yeah, the U.S. is superior, no matter how bad things get. At least I'm not in a different place. At least I'm not that. And it works domestically, too. We see with the pandemic ravaging Black communities, that allows liberals, white Americans of all political stripes to say, wow, at least I'm not in that situation. And those circumstances are, and at times, deserving, because the United States is an empire based on white supremacy. It's an empire based on capitalist exploitation. And these ideologies help universalize those values, democracy and liberty, and the idea of superiority in order to ensure that those things maintain themselves. And I think it just has relevance to all of these questions that we discussed.
No, I mean, I think you're spot on, Danny, and it really comes with the repetition. And when you hear the same message all day, every day, over and over again, you start to believe the lies. That was Danny Haifung, an activist, writer, and political analyst. Danny, where can people find more of you and your work online?
Sure. So I write a weekly piece, Black Agenda Report. So www.blackagendareport.com. My new issue is out today. And you can also find me on Twitter at of HO, Spirit of Ho, and you can find me on Facebook. I share a lot of my work there.
Very cool. That was Danny Haifung, the activist, writer, and political analyst. Danny, thank you again. With that, we'll turn to another quick break here on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in DC. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show. This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns. Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is DC.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here technologically with my disembodied co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's keep going against the grain. If you guys dig what Bob and I are putting down, give us a like, give us a share. Also, if you want to comment on something that we've already discussed, feel free to give us a call at 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We appreciate your engagement. It makes the show what it is. So, Bob, you're not doing well when the campaign that your boss ran back in 2008 comes out with an op-ed basically telling you, Joe Biden, do the opposite of what you're doing now. Now, the Joe Biden thing is complicated by the Reid stuff. Because honestly, say for the moment you had a million lefties and those million lefties had organized themselves and those million lefties said, look, if you take Medicare for all and you expand Social Security and you get rid of debt, you get our votes. But this gets complicated the moment that the guy's accused of an allegation that some of them may actually find credible. Also, polling has shown that this has cut into Biden's favorability a bit, dropping him down several points to the level of where Trump is, even though Trump has a higher unfavorability. David Axelrod and David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign strategist and campaign manager, had memorable lines in an article like, Biden's most memorable moments on the campaign trail have come through spontaneous, intensely moving encounters with people who, like Mr. Biden, have endured searing struggle and loss. His authentic sense of empathy is a quality uniquely suited for this agonizing moment. Now Mr. Biden is mired in his basement, speaking to us remotely like an astronaut beaming back to Earth with the International Space Station. Here's another one. Yet in the midst of a catastrophic virus and devastating economic coma that command our full attention, Mr. Biden finds himself on the outside looking in. Governors and mayors have taken the center stage in the only story that matters. Here's another point. The wild part about this is when you look at some of the polling, Joe Biden is rated less than Donald Trump in regards to the handling of the coronavirus. And for them making the point of them saying, hey, you need to use TikTok more and Facebook more and Twitter more. You got to get more into the digital format, man. You also made the point that Trump can't beat this in front of basically a referendum on his abilities. So he's going to make it a referendum on Biden, meaning to tear Biden down, and that Biden has to have quick responses, like the Tara Reid stuff. You can't just sit back and let that soak. You gotta go after it. Here's the point. Let's listen to Joe Biden being Joe Biden in this clip that's coming up. Let's hear the clip.
This pandemic. The pandemic is that the president has no intercourse whatsoever with the rest of the world on dealing with these things. We led, like Barack Obama led in the in the pandemic that occurred when we were in office. It was kept in Africa. We organized the world. We put things together.
We organized the world. We had intercourse with the world. That's what we did. Intercourse with the world. That's the guy who you want on TikTok and Facebook and Twitter. That's the guy who you're telling needs to get a digital format. They made the point that Joe Biden's campaigns were going back to like the 50s or whatever. But the catch here is you're basically saying Joe Biden needs to do the exact opposite of what Joe Biden has been doing in order to stand a chance in this race. I am sorry. I don't know how Joe Biden is going to do that in the middle of a pandemic, and even if it wasn't a pandemic. Your problem is that basically Joe Biden was never hit during the race. And because he was never hit during the race, you have a situation that basically ends up where everything that takes place is now going to happen in the general. Bob, I don't think they realize this, but Sanders not going after Biden didn't do him any favors. Trump is going to line up with all of this stuff, and this, basic assistance, I don't know if that's going to be enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that Joe Biden forced to stay at home is kind of the same strategy that Hillary Clinton had in 2016. She also wanted just to stay at home. She didn't go to Wisconsin or Michigan or some of these other places that she really needed to have got into. It'll be really interesting there as we talk about how does this play out through the election season. I don't know if Democrats, and they're still trying to figure out, are Democrats hurt more by low voter turnout? Are they helped by the absentee voting model, the mail-in ballots? Does it help Joe Biden to not have to go out on the campaign trail when he is somebody who is very good at basically working the crowd? So, Jamal, I think there's a lot of questions to be answered still of what his strategy should be, but I think mostly they're just trying to keep him quiet, and hopefully the governors and mayors of cities who are Democrats can basically say, look, we're fighting this on our own. Who is Donald Trump? And I'll say this again and again, that it's up to Donald Trump to basically win or lose this election. I don't think Joe Biden's going to play much of a role in somehow appearing as more presidential than Donald Trump. I know it sounds crazy that somebody couldn't appear more presidential, but Jamal, he is in quite a bit of trouble. If it's not this story, it's going to be other stories. And I don't know exactly, are Democrats just pretending other Obama-Biden related moments don't come out? And I'm speaking now, and I want to talk a little bit about the latest from the Ukraine gate that is waiting in the wings to snap up Joe Biden whenever he gets too much of a momentum. I just feel like time and time again, anytime Biden starts to break away, it's going to be another story from his time with the Obama administration. And now here we have it coming back up is the Ukraine issue. And Democrats wanted to play this card, Jamal. They wanted to play corruption in Eastern Europe card against Trump. Well, that card is coming back against Biden and the Democrats. So that's on you guys. I don't know what to say. So the latest news here, though, Jamal, yesterday it was revealed that in March, Republican Senators Ron Johnson and Chuck Grassley requested that the National Archives and Records Administration, which preserves grassroots government records, would release information from certain meetings connected to Ukraine held by the Obama administration. So Obama's basically going to be scrutinized as Biden runs. In response, the Obama administration wrote a March 13th letter obtained and first reported by BuzzFeed News that, quote, the request for early release of presidential records in order to give credence to a Russian disinformation campaign, one that has already been thoroughly investigated by a bipartisan congressional committee, is without precedent. Yes, it is without precedent. That's the time we are in, Mr. Obama. According to BuzzFeed, the letter represents the first reported comments by Obama or his team on the investigation, led by Johnson and Grassley, into whether Biden, as vice president, withheld aid to Ukraine to pressure the country to drop a probe into Burisma Holdings, an energy company with ties to Biden's son. So does Barack Obama have a right to be so upset? Is Obama's team overreacting to what seems like a simple request because they're annoyed, or that there is something damning to be had in those meetings against Biden?
Yeah.
Well, Jamar, let me first play a clip here. And let
play
everybody hear once again Joe
Joe
Biden. Here's Joe Biden talking about how he pressured Ukrainian President Poroshenko and at the time Prime Minister Yatsenyuk into firing the Ukrainian prosecutor Viktor Shokin. Here is Biden in his own words.
I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him.
He said,
I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion.
We'll cut it off
So
there. I
you're
think
not
at the
getting
end he
$1
uses language not suitable for radio in the excitement that he had. He goes, basically, we got rid of the guy and we got the son of the bee out of office. And so Joe Biden bragging with some choice words, to say the least there. I was going to say the F word there. I was slipping my tongue.
And by the way, on stage in front of a lot of people. Like, this wasn't a back room.
Saying the son of a bee, and basically slaps the interviewer on the back and he tells, hey, heck of a story there, huh? Let me be fair here, Jamal, before I ask for your feedback here. The Democrats claim Viktor Shokin, the prosecutor in Ukraine, wasn't involved in investigating Burisma, a natural gas company people know are tied to Joe Biden's son. They fired Shokin because they wanted basically him out of office because he was not pursuing corruption among the country's politicians. And that was according to Ukrainian official and 4 former American officials who specialized in Ukraine and Europe. Jamal, whether Barack Obama likes it or not, these type of things will get brought up against the former vice president. I don't know how you can be annoyed by party politics when you yourself were engaged in them. Hell, Barack Obama tore up the own Democratic Party to run ahead of Hillary Clinton. So who is Barack Obama to complain about politics when he made one of the most savvy political moves of all time and jumped ahead of Hillary Clinton? If anybody should be angry at anybody, it should be Clinton at Obama. But here Obama's upset that people have questions about Joe Biden, who is currently interviewing for president of the United States.
I don't know what they expected, right? I mean, look, politics is tit for tat. Now, my mom always say when you go tit for tat, she was like, oh, that's so childish. And I would ask her, what else do you have? Now, the reason I asked her, what else do you have, is because if you're engaging in some kind of interplay between people, companies, or countries, when something happens to you, there's a response to the thing that happens to you. If there's no response, then you have a sovereign. You have no way of basically hitting back the thing that can basically hit you whenever it wants. But in the context of something like this, where you have political parties, they have decided to investigate Donald Trump for the entire time Trump was in that office, going so far as to impeach Trump. When Bush was in that office, Bush invaded a country, lied about it, got 1 million people killed, spent $7 trillion to do it, and Nancy Pelosi couldn't be bothered. So it's like, put this in context. You have a party that literally investigated the other party for 3 years and then found the flimsiest thing to impeach him on. But what was the thing they used? The fact that Trump didn't give money to the Ukraine.
I'm fine with that.
Say that again?
Yeah, I think that's the point that needs to be made, though, because 3 years of investigations into government corruption, mishandling of funds, the privatization of land, to basically the emoluments clause and how Trump is basically padded his pockets. Well, do all of that. I don't care. That's great. Government as oversight and accountability, absolutely. Perfect. But when your focus is on porn stars, on Eastern European corruption, on Russiagate, because Adam Schiff just wants to continue to push the Patriot Act and FISA and government surveillance, no, that's where I get lost on you. It's about emails. It's about Benghazi. It's all about celebritization. They go after the guy because of his hair and not his policies. And that's what I think Americans are sick of. I think they're sick of both parties completely. That's why people are checked out of the electoral system, because everything comes down to personality. And it comes down to the individual as opposed to the policies. And after the break here, we'll talk more about the policies. And that's where I get frustrated, because I'm like, look at the policies. If you want this guy not to be the president, just share people with them Joe Biden's policy for Black America. If it's about winning the black vote, go show this policy to every Black person in America and say, do you really think this will help you? But we don't have that, Jamal. Instead, we focus on whatever it is about the personality of Joe Biden and all of these other issues that we're just going to debate ad nauseum. But the policies, focus on the policies. And Democrats and Republicans have said, nope, no care for policy. It's all about personality.
No, they don't do that. They don't do policy. I mean, the policy stuff, like, you have people living on the street. And to me, that's like, oh, God, that's horrible. Why don't people focus on why that's that way? That never really gets put up, because that's not really sexy. That's not really glamorous. That doesn't really get to the heart of things. Like, policy is hard. Personality is easy. And I think that's kind of the issue in the way that we do when we look at our election stuff. I have to say, though, that plan, and Joe Biden, I call it Joe Biden's Negro plan, it angers me so much. Like, this is, and it angers me on multiple fronts, but it also angers me from the standpoint of Sanders. Like, Sanders was around during the exact same time Joe Biden was around. These guys were in politics forever. And the items that took place in like the 80s, people who are alive today may not necessarily know what was taking place back in the 80s, but Sanders does. The mainstream media does. And despite that, Joe Biden would lie on this campaign, and despite lying on this campaign, they would never call it. And it's like, you see the videos of him saying, okay, yeah, I lied about the civil rights stuff. And then we'll do it again. And media is like, yep, we see no evil. We don't see anything wrong.
But I mean, I guess that's where we are, though, right? It's like, it's about personality. It's about Joe Biden, the personality, the guy that was the lifeguard at the pool with the Black kids who rubbed his legs. And it's about him talking with people and knowing the culture of church basements and being very comfortable in all Black rooms and being the funny guy, the jock white guy in the room. It's all about the personality. It's all about the swag. It's about Biden and Obama, the cool Black president who is a great orator and is cool right-hand man, the sidekick Joe. It doesn't matter. None of these policies matter whatsoever. And the Democratic Party, and what we'll talk about after the break, do not care about policy, because if they actually cared about policy, they wouldn't even be putting out what they're putting out. It's not even like the stuff is well-researched. It sounds great. Lift every voice, the national anthem of Black America. Lift every voice. And people say, oh, man, they must care, because people don't look past sloganeering and the policies. Jamal, that is our first hour here on Political Misfits. After the break, we will get deep into what Joe Biden thinks about Black America. We'll also talk about a brutal and inhumane killing of a 25-year-old man in Georgia. Just new video coming out here over the last few days. Absolutely horrific. Arrest has still not been made in that case. And we'll also talk about an asteroid narrowly missing Earth in our weekly Revelation segment. In many ways, it feels like the asteroid did indeed hit tomorrow, but another one missed us. That and much more. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlagerberg here, kind of sort of still with Jamarl Thomas. We're both at home, but we're bringing you live programming here on Radio Sputnik all week, Monday through Friday, 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Here are Political Misfits, and after this, you have The Great Show by Any Means Necessary, followed by Loud and Clear and The Critical Hour. So stay with us. We'll be here all day, 105.5 FM here in the nation's capital. You can check us out on the Progressive Soapbox if you want to watch us on YouTube. Make sure to like and comment our work there. Share it with your friends. And if you're not able to check out our show daily on SputnikNews.com, you can also check it out on any podcast platform where you may listen to podcasts. Search us there, and you can find Jamarl and myself. We continue our show here talking about some domestic news. Give us a call, 202-521-1320 if you want to get in on the conversation, 202-521-1320. Over the next hour, we'll be talking about Joe Biden's Lift Every Voice plan targeted at Black communities, New York being forced to proceed with the presidential primary, and the latest job numbers and stay-at-home rule breakers. We start with a tragic story here. First, about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old black male in Georgia. Video has now been released showing Ahmaud jogging on February 23rd in Brunswick, Georgia. In the video, you can see Ahmaud approaching a stationary pickup from behind. He tries to bypass the truck and then is seen struggling with a man carrying a shotgun. There's a muffled shouting and shotgun shots are heard. Ahmaud tried to run from the truck before he collapses to the ground, having been shot. The two men that stopped Mr. Arbery were Gregory McMichael, a former district attorney investigator, and his son, Travis McMichael. This is where the story now gets truly bizarre. In a police report, Gregory McMichael says he saw Mr. Arbery and believed he resembled the suspect in a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. He and his son armed themselves and pursued him in a pickup truck in an effort to conduct a citizen's arrest. So they basically get ahead of the jogging Arbery to then basically arrest him in a citizen's arrest. Make sense of that. Here to talk about this murder is Kimberlyn Carter, an unapologetically Black political strategist for progressive campaigns focusing on economic, criminal, and climate justice. Kimberlyn, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Bob.
Kimberlyn, a tragic story. Again, the last time we had you on as well, we were talking about the deaths from COVID-19, but racism here in America is still running rampant. You're in Georgia. Tell us a little bit more why there was not an initial arrest of Gregory and Travis McMichael and whether or not you think there will be.
Well, just let me just say something very quickly, Bob. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit tardy on the call. I was participating in a conference call with Black Mamas Against Gun Violence. It's a grassroots group of Black women here in Georgia who've all lost their children senselessly to gun violence. On yesterday, I participated in a call and listened to Ahmaud's mother, Wanda Cooper, talk about her son and talk about how he has been jogging since his youth. He was a high school all-star linebacker, always a great athlete. She said that everywhere they've lived, he's always been a jogger. Everybody's known, him being a jogger. As you can see, the hashtag they've started, I Run With Maud, because, they called him, most people that know him call him Maud instead of Ahmaud. And so in this particular community, everyone knew him. They said they never knew what time he would come back from jogging because he's the kind of jogger waving at everybody, stopping to help them. Just a really great kid. And so these two guys, they've seen him. This is not some big, large, sprawling metropolis. It's a small town. People know each other, and it is just absolutely painful, absolutely ridiculous. This particular DA doesn't have to do all this grand jury business, knowing that right now the grand juries aren't set to even resume until late June because of the COVID situations here from a judicial order. She can place the charges, DA can place the charges without having to convene a grand jury, but this is all about protecting white supremacy, in protecting the blue wall, if so, and it's just a lot of disparities and injustices going to play out.
Kimberlyn, what I thought was so striking to it regarding case law and these type of shootings is that they didn't claim stand your ground or castle doctrine, basically a stand your ground case since they were in public street. The two people who eventually murder Ahmaud were ahead of him, waiting for him, basically. And what they're trying to claim is that they were doing a citizen's arrest. And to do a citizen's arrest, which is like bizarre in enough of itself, you actually have to watch the person commit the crime or be in the vicinity of the crime. And they're just basically saying that they thought he looked like somebody who at some point over some time in the past had committed these burglaries. And it speaks volumes to the fact that an arrest hasn't been made during this time because everything will be delayed and these two men will continue to stay out of jail even longer than they already have.
And so what we have to understand about this larger narrative coming from this White House is when Donald Trump said we're going to reopen America, we're going to reopen America, he literally gave these yahoos a call to action. And so what they think they are doing is performing their of America. And like you said about this, citizens arrest, this Barney Fife small town type of ideology. Well, Glenn County, not only does Glenn County have a sheriff's department, but the city of Brunswick has its own police department. So I'm saying, there's enough law enforcement in that whole area that we don't need citizens arming themselves practicing vigilante justice. But this is just vigilante justice. This is racial profiling. This is public modern day lynching. And unfortunately, guys, I feel like it's just the beginning, and we are going to see more and more of these types of things, like we're seeing with folks standing with AK-47s and AR-15 rifles in our state capitals across this country without any law enforcement check on any of that whatsoever.
Yeah, it's stressful times, and it's going to continue to be stressful, and I think people will pull the trigger in situations where in the past maybe they just threatened somebody with a gun. Kimberlyn, I wanted to slightly pivot, but staying into the same world of conversation. One, Joe Biden has called for the arrest in that case and for justice for Ahmaud in that case. And at the same time he does that, he also puts out his Lift Every Voice plan targeting Black communities. And one way in which we can address racial inequality and these injustices is through policy. But yet, in my opinion, the Democrats don't ever do that when they have their turn in office. Joe Biden decided, as I mentioned, to put out his Lift Every Voice plan, Kimberlyn. And warning here for our listeners, if you're looking to go and read it yourself and you don't want the spoilers, because we're going to talk a lot about it, go tune out of our show and go read it right now. I know it's something special to experience outrage, disappointment, and embarrassment for the Democrats firsthand. So if you haven't read the plan and you were waiting, go do that. For the rest of you, stay with us here. We'll walk you through it and save those 30 minutes of your life. Kimberlyn, I know you got a chance to look closely at the plan. I think you got a sneak peek before it was released to the wider public. For me, the plan does what the Democratic Party does best, and that's sloganeering. The plan had all the good liberal stuff: health disparities in the time of COVID-19, investment in poor Black communities, increased loans and grants to Black businesses, new credit checks to break up the monopoly of credit score corporations, and the classic of all phrases, lots of criminal justice reforms. On paper, all of it reads as well thought out practical policies. However, when you actually start to pick apart the policies and look at what is happening within states and cities, you watch the plan blow up. A few highlights to get us going. Subject headers include, quote, end the criminalization of poverty and stop corporations from profiteering off of incarceration. Yep, that's coming from Joe Crime Bill Biden and from a guy who has taken dozens of donations from billionaires. Another header here, quote, give local elected officials the tools and resources they need to combat gentrification. Curious what tools he'll give them when Democratic mayors in cities such as Chicago, San Francisco, New York City, and Washington, D.C. have been the ones driving gentrification in their cities through their own tools that they, the neoliberal Democrats, created themselves. They already have the tools. They're the gentrifiers. How are you going to fight them yourselves? And finally, reinvigorate community-oriented policing. It says in the plan, Kimberlin, policing works best when officers are out of their cruisers and walking the streets, engaging with getting to know members of their communities. But in order to do that, police departments need resources to hire a sufficient number of officers. Kimberlin, none of these policies are actual solutions. There is no solution to the gentrification beyond giving poor people homes. There is no solution to ending poverty beyond giving people money. There is no such thing as community policing. Anyone try to find me a study that shows the efficacy of community policing. There is zero relationship between a reduction in violent crime and the number of police getting to know neighbors. Kimberlin, for me, these policies are absolute trash and are incredibly weak in addressing actual material conditions facing Blacks in America. What say you?
I say that it's an insult on 3 different levels. Number one, I find the name of it to be insulting. And just like, when we ask these questions about when these designers like Gucci and Dolce & Gabbana make these racist mistakes, and we say, well, didn't they have any Black people in the room to look at this and say this is things wrong with this? Where were the Black people in the room to say that the name of this plan is an insult? I feel like it's Columbusing, and I the name of it, number one. Number two, the price tag on that white paper, whatever they want to call it. So the $990,000 dog, that's not even enough to solve problems Anacostia.
How are you doing, Kimberly? Oh, I'm sorry. No, you're fine. I agree with you that the name is appalling. I find it to be appalling on a few points. That Joe Biden is the person who's putting out a plan like this, and the criminal justice part, considering Joe Biden spent all of his life putting people, of a darker persuasion behind bars. I'm always amazed at Democrats when they do stuff like this, because it's singling out African Americans as if African Americans don't require health care or Social Security or expansion of getting rid of student debt. Like, these things dramatically affect the bottom end of the income scale, which will actually assist African Americans also, while also assisting the rest of the community. I don't think politics works like this. Meaning, I don't think you can get anything out of politics without any kind of leverage in order to pull something out of whoever you're dealing with. And African Americans voting to the tune of 90% basically neuters any real possibility of that group getting anything. Now, am I right or wrong on that?
And you're right. And there is no way that Joe Biden or anyone on the Biden team is going to convince me that what we know should be happening right now, and that is his folks should be inviting Bernie's folks to the table, should have the Sanders team at the table. There is no possible way that you're going to tell me that they had a conversation with anyone with a slither of Bernie Sanders support in their bloodstream, and this is what is coming out as a policy paper. None of the policies that have been put forth by this Biden campaign have meat to them. There is no sizzle. They are all at best, at even best, not even a decent white. I read it. All my blood did was boil.
Yeah, I mean, it's structural issues too in there that they just completely miss. I mean, one was to set up a new credit agency, basically saying the 3 major corporations that do credit checks here in the United States are corrupt and they're broken and the credit system's broken. But Jamal, if you don't have credit, what does it matter if there's a new credit company coming out to give new scores out? No bank is going to lend to you. And so these underlying structural issues and the dollar amount on it, often people say, oh, we should just pull all black business money and keep all money within black communities. It doesn't work like that. The U.S. government is working with trillions upon trillions of dollars, and white people have built wealth in this country for the last 200 years. You're not going to all of a sudden just in a matter of a sweep of a pen give a few $1 billion and somehow have enough power with that money to influence the political system. So then the question then, I guess, is asking, how do black people take back some of that control? Because I think the Democratic Party will say, cool, Jamal, you don't have enough money to donate to us that we need. We got plenty of billionaire friends. You don't have enough votes in a lot of cities because we're focused on white voters in strategic places, and we'll get maybe the Latinx vote. I think there's enough that the Democrats can constantly point to that has allowed them to bifurcate the communities so they don't actually have power. And so then maybe it's an internal movement within the black communities to coalesce around certain policies that they can have a unifying power. But it seems like as long as they can get the Clybourns and the John Lewises and others to constantly endorse them, that black power isn't built up in a way that can actually pressure the Democratic Party.
The last 40 years, lefties and African Americans have basically been doing politics backwards. They've lumped themselves in with the Democratic Party, talking about African Americans for obvious reasons of issues of civil rights and so forth. But there are times when environmental factors change, will require human beings to also change with those environmental factors in order to get into a better standing, let's say from point A to point B. The time for lefties and the time for African Americans being in the Democratic Party is over. That doesn't mean to go to the Republican Party, God no, but it just means that you stop considering yourself a Democrat. If you really want to get Medicare for all accomplished, if you really want to get Social Security expanded, if you really want to get rid of student debt, you can never do it inside a party that absolutely, completely, 1,000% disagrees with the very basis of your ideological framework. And that was proven when every last one of those Democrats, when asked, would you steal this nomination from Sanders if he gets to the end without enough delegates? And every last one of them, including Elizabeth Warren, said yes, which means all of them understood that they would lose because no Bernie supporter would have voted for anybody who they were going to put up after that. They were willing to crash it to Trump as long as it stopped you and Sanders from putting through those particular policies. I guess my point is, if you're trying to do anything, talking about the black vote or lefties, working in the party is not the way to do it. Your way.
That wasn't I guess my question, Jamar, and maybe Kimberly. My question was, what does that alternative organizing look like? We know to lead the Democratic Party.
That's what I'm saying.
But what does that organizing look like?
That's what I'm saying. The goal of that is to yank yourself out of the party and function behind policy. To basically say, these are the policies that I'm for. Take it or leave it. And oftentimes the problem is that people consider themselves Democrats, so they feel bad about not voting Democrat, or they feel some kind of way about it, when it's the opposite. You're supposed to use political leverage. Not being in the party structure allows a certain degree of political leverage where you can influence by making them lose. If you have the capacity to make them lose, you have the capacity of leverage. That's where it needs to start. But unfortunately, African Americans vote to the tune of like 90% Democrat. And lefties, even when they don't want to vote for the Democrat, they still vote to the tune of like 75%.
So, Kimberly, I guess I'm curious from that perspective, if we agree, and I know you still work within Democratic politics, what does that look like on the ground, though? I mean, who writes that other policy that has credibility and authority, and can you actually move people to see beyond the two parties? I think once you get onto the ground and into the weeds of day-to-day organizing, people aren't paying attention, so you have to give them very concrete, easily digestible messaging. That's where the tricky part gets. Like, how do you reorganize people to think beyond what's currently taking place?
Well, I think the two things that we definitely are going to have to do, and that is we have to reorganize the bench, and we have to change the pipeline. And that's going to come from how we recruit candidates, how we train them, and how we help them to win. And so because a lot of the party's power is there in terms of black power. A lot of the party black power is very much tied to incumbencies, and I don't have any death wish on anyone. So please understand when I talk about this, it's tied to incumbencies of age group people that are getting wearier by the year. And so we have to start thinking very, very differently. I was in AOC that how we are in this, that if we have an incumbent that we know is not doing the work of the people or doing the work who need aren't doing the work of their constituency, that we are leaning in to just like, well, we just keep them there for the I word. We've got to rethink that. And I know some of my friends who are listening are going to be really, really upset. We got to start flipping some of these incumbents, bottom line.
Wait, I have to interrupt. You know, the DSCC and the DCCC had put in a rule that basically they would blacklist any company that worked with any lefty group that tried to take down an incumbent. So that basically means that there is no pathway in real terms to take down an incumbent in the Democratic Party. You're just stuck with that dinosaur forever.
Actually, the issue with that is the expectation that your only ability to fundraise or your only ability to run a strong campaign is that you have to actually go through those two organizations. I can show you right now a young man by the name of Michael Owens right here in the state of Georgia who is running, excuse me, I'm in my outdoor office, who is running one hell of a progressive congressional race against one of our blue dogs, David Scott. And he is running a policy power-packed truth power congressional race. And first, we're like, oh, whatever, no one was paying attention. But he has grassroots organizing under his belt, and he is building tight force right on the ground in the face of the DCCC, as well as AOC. I'm talking about incumbents that wouldn't even debate, that don't even debate other people that run against them. Yeah, she didn't even get the guy to debate her. Michael's running into the same thing. But this is the type of process that we have to begin to follow for the model that we currently have to begin to effect change. Because like you, I understand, we do have a lot of our folks, a lot of Black folks who are extremely tied to the Democratic Party, and breaking that umbilical cord and trying to birth a new mindset, a new political mindset in Black folks is going to be tough. It is going to be tough.
Yeah, and I think it is going to be tough. And I guess that's why I'm always confused, Jamal, of like, if it hasn't been broken already, when will it be broken? And one of the other plans here, I just want to close out here on the Lift Every Voice that Joe Biden plan for Black communities in America. It has a section titled Eliminate the Funding Gap Between White and Non-White Districts and Rich and Poor Districts in order to give teachers a raise and expand STEM curriculum in underserved school districts. Even plans like this are short-sighted if you actually engage or live within these communities. In my hometown in Rockford, Illinois, we have roughly 1,200 children considered homeless in the sense that they move between 4 to 5 times in a given school year. And here in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, there's over 7,000 youth that are homeless. I don't understand. Do people really think that having a few more 3D printers in a school is somehow going to close the wealth and education gaps? If people aren't aware of these gaps right now, Jamal, I guess it's just like at some point, when is it a lost cause?
Yeah, I'm not sure when it's a lost cause, Bob. That's a good question.
All right, well, we're lost on the answer of when it will be a lost cause. Kimberly, I want to get one more thought from you here on a final story with you. There were efforts in New York, as we have reported, about the state looking to cancel its presidential primary. In some ways, it made sense on the surface, global pandemic, plus the RNC and DNC settling on their candidates of choice. If you look anywhere deeper than the surface, in my opinion, it was an incredible affront to democracy and voter participation in America's limited two-party system. Well, the canceled primary, though, has now become uncanceled. A federal judge in Manhattan ruled late Tuesday that New York must hold its primary on June 23rd, contending that canceling it would be unconstitutional and take away the ability of the candidates to receive delegates for the party's convention in August. Removing the candidates from the ballot and, quote, canceling the presidential primary denied them the chance to run and denied voters the right to cast ballots for the candidate and their political beliefs, according to U.S. District Judge Annalisa Torres. The lawsuit was brought on behalf of former presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, who argued in a lawsuit April 28th that it was illegal for New York to cancel the primary. Kimberly, I'm not going to somehow try and compare the GOP and what they do to America's democratic values through their assaults on the voting system, but I will say the Democrats do not have the strongest record on encouraging and expanding voting. And this last move here in New York reeks of corruption, or at least did not have democracy at the forefront.
I was livid when the primary was canceled. I applaud the federal judge for standing up and saying this is BS and we're going to have this primary, and Bernie Sanders' name better be on there, and he better get his New York allocation of delegates.
Talk.
I'm curious what you think then. Is Bernie Sanders back in this race?
Tell you right now, I am here in Georgia with a contingent of people who are challenging our state party right now on the delegate selection process, because our presidential preference primary was changed. The 10% rule still applies, even though, even with the suspension of the campaign, just all the candidates' names are still on the ballot. People are going to be voting. It is a very clear possibility here in the state of Georgia that not only will Bernie surpass the 10%, but possibly Elizabeth Warren and even Michael Bloomberg when the votes are cast on June 9th. In the past, if the candidate got at least, well, at one point it was 1%, but now they changed it to 10%. If the candidate got 10%, they still earned delegates. And that meant delegates in all of our 15 congressional districts, because we have congressional district delegate races. So right now, a contingent of us are double checking the process going on with the Democratic Party of Georgia as to how this allocation and this voting of the delegates are going to happen here. And it is very frustrating. It is extremely frustrating when the banner that you're sitting under is doing the most damage to the democracy. It is very disturbing.
Yeah, and tomorrow the credibility of the Democratic Party is just like out the window at some point. And even if they're being intentionally corrupt or intentionally doing this stuff, they do it in such a sloppy, half-thoughtful manner that they're basically in a time of the pandemic saying, well, we don't want to have a primary because of the pandemic. Well, instead you ended up with a lawsuit. You ended up having judges having to make rulings, and now you have to go back through this. So they ended up just creating more work for everybody through this process. Just have your primary, complete it. Joe Biden's already a shoo-in, but yet you create this extra mess of a layer for what? For what?
Kimberlyn, I'm curious. Does this... I know it matters in the sense of in a democratic process way. I agree. I even get that it has delegates associated with it. Agreed. But from my standpoint, the horse that I was riding in this race was Sanders. And Sanders had put up his spears a long time before he even suspended his campaign. So in the grand scheme of things, does this matter in any real, legitimate, tangible way?
Well, it matters because in the caucuses, when the caucuses have their individual meetings during the convention where platform items are debated and discussed. I know that people think that it's all big conventioneering and balloons and crazy boards. But there's a lot that goes on during the day. The Democratic National Conventions and, of course, the Republican National Conventions as well, that do that in terms of influencing the platform, influencing the policies that the party is going to put forth. And it puts a lot of pressure on power because power can't run from you. It's sitting right in front of you. And in Philadelphia, I didn't attend the DNC in Philly, but I had several friends that did, besides Clinton and Sanders' side. And I will tell you, even though it was contentious on the convention floor, a lot was learned, a lot of pressure was made to bear during the day in terms of the policies and the direction of the party. So I think that I think it has to happen. I think it's something that needs to happen. I think that the party has presented the idea that everyone is not rubber stamping. It's not a monolith. That there are people who think the same. I mean, you can't use a big analogy, only have intent mindset.
Yeah. We'll see if things change. That's been one of the themes of our show today. How do you change people's mindsets that have been in a certain position for a long, long time? With that, unfortunately, we are out of time with the unapologetically Black political strategist, Kimberlyn Carter. Kimberlyn, I love your hot takes online. Where can people find more of you and your work?
Yes, they can find me, of course, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. They can catch me at CarterStrategiesLLC.com. I will be taking on a new project with an organization called Rep Georgia Institute, Incorporated, which has a C3 and a C4, totally designed to elect progressive candidates across the state of Georgia. So, Bob, I'll be talking to you some more about this new role that I'll be taking in as executive director of this organization and some of the work that we've already done and what we're trying to do to really, really change the political landscape of the state of Georgia.
Thank you for that. And thank you and congratulations on your new role. It's very exciting. Thank you again for joining us. That was Kimberlyn Carter. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in DC. We're back after this.
Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. You hear that sound? It is Wednesday, Revelations. Now, this is one of my favorite sections. We get to talk about all sorts of things of this world and out of this world, often involving UFOs left up to my own devices. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. We have two good revelations for today. Now, I'm going to let Bob choose the revelations, which one goes first. We have terrifying, or we have horrifying, but in a different way, with a little bit of chest thumping from me. Which one you want, Bob?
All right, well, let's terrify me a little bit as if I haven't been enough so already today.
All right, so an asteroid sneaks by our satellites. Now, I'm going to read this. A previously unseen asteroid the size of a truck flew about 4,350 miles over the Pacific Ocean on Monday, making it one of the closest pass-bys on our planet on record. Astronomers had not noticed the asteroid's 2020 JJ's existence as it was discovered using the Mount Lemmon survey in Arizona right around the time it reached its closest point to us. Meaning, they didn't see it until it was basically on us. Now, there's no reaction time at that point. And I think people think that we have like an entire view of the sky all over the world. And that's not true at all. There's all sorts of blind spots that we have in the sky. We only can see what we're looking at. And you can't necessarily look at everything at the exact same time around the entire globe. We chart and those type of things, but at the end of the day, just like this comet or just like this meteor, got that close to the planet, there could be something much larger right now aiming right at us. That is, I would say, terrifying, because I don't think Bruce Willis is going to get into a rocket ship and go and try to, stop the comet, especially depending on the size, depending on the weight, all that stuff. And all of those things will determine whether or not we can do anything about it at all. And then I would bet you this, Bob, they would say, how much does it cost? How much does it cost to avert a natural disaster?
What happens? Like, would we feel it? Like, I guess I don't understand. Like, the asteroid hits the Earth, does it just spiral out of control and, like, gravity's gone? Like, I can't even imagine.
Sometimes what happens is, if it hits the Earth too hard enough, you may have debris and everything else blow up. Think of it like a bomb going off. And then the debris and everything else could effectively go all around the world and basically cover the world in a kind of ash or something where the sunlight doesn't necessarily go out. You're talking about earthquakes, floods, maybe destabilization of the climate. I mean, you're talking about basically transfiguring Earth in a very short period of time with a sharp jolt. And again, it depends on how big it is. I mean, some of those things are going to blow up just in the atmosphere, like the one that hit Russia, I think it was a few years ago. But the ones that don't, and the ones that do hit this planet, for the longest time, they didn't believe that asteroids could ever hit Earth. They just took it as a religious belief. I guess it was too horrifying, but they realized, oh God, maybe it could. So
can I still choose that option?
Yeah, you can choose. You can choose that one. But we're also going to do.
Fine again. I told you, Jamal, that the thing missed us. I told you from the get it wasn't going to hit us. There we go again. We're fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's very possible. I mean, we can't. Hopefully we can see it, but we at this point. So the second one is my favorite. So the New York Times comes out with a bombshell piece about a secret military program to study UFOs. Now, people from the program come out of the shadows and start talking to the press, including military pilot that flew on 9/11, saying, yes, I was in air with that thing for several minutes. It couldn't be one of ours. Now, 3 videos get leaked, and there's talk about materials that are being studied and analyzed, and we also get a list of studies that our military and corporations were involved in, this kind of Star Trek-esque studies. It was initially unclear whether these videos came from the Pentagon, but this channel, this face, who was following the news on that, told you that the paper trail had been established that they were from the Pentagon. Now, the Navy, under pressure to explain what's going on, changed their protocols to allow their people to basically submit UFO interactions. All of the governments, or the government at this point, is legitimizing this issue. Now, for example, the Aspen Institute, in a meeting called Military Competition with China, Maintaining America's Edge, U.S. Indo-Pacific commander gave a spirited and strong-jaw presentation on the subject matter. Now, a brave gentleman in this meeting, I don't know how he got there, stood up, raised his hand, and let's hear the clip. Captain Philip David, Commander, U.S. Indo-Pacific Commander at the Aspen Institute. Let's play the clip.
You take questions on UFOs, Admiral?
There's a reporting process for that, and an office that handles that, and it was happening over a pretty finite period of time several years ago. I'll leave it at that.
Now, there was giggling, but if you notice his answer is yes. We were encountering UFOs for a period of time. He just answered the guy's question. Now, all of this formalizing the legitimacy of this issue went into hypergear last week when the Pentagon put out 3 videos, the same 3 videos from Tom DeLonge, but put out 3 videos. Now people's heads exploded. They were like, oh my God, the Pentagon just put out UFO videos. And I'm sitting here like, I put these videos out like a year ago. I covered the story. I proved it, but that's okay. I'm not going to chest up on that. I'm just making the point clear that this channel was the first one to get those videos and to make that point known that the Pentagon was there. I'll just leave it at that. The point I'm making here is they're legitimizing and formalizing an issue, meaning in people's minds, the UFO thing becomes, well, I know the Pentagon put those videos out. I know that the military is studying alien materials with that UFO company. My point is, in the formalization of this, though, what does it mean? And what it means is all sorts of odd dystopian things start to happen the moment that senators get involved, the president gets involved, congressmen start asking questions like, what are those things? How are those things running? People start accepting the physics of the way those things are going, and scientists starts inventing and working with things, questions that they didn't have answers to before, that they didn't even think of. Now they have answers to. Even if they don't know how to do it, they've got answers based on the data that the U.S. military and that the companies were taking. Your world changes. Your world changes quickly, meaning it can be dystopian if all of this tech and all of this stuff go into military or go into some kind of corporate interests, or it can be a freeing maneuver in which humanity uses that technology for the benefit of humanity. Now, Bob, which one do you think, from where we are now, that we're going to go? Dystopian, paradise.
It depends on who the people, who it is, right? If it is like a Wakanda-esque situation, there's some civilization that is buried away in the middle. The Atlantis is still a thing, and they figured out how to make these ships and stuff, and because of the underwater physics of it all, they were able to better
Well, let me ask you a better question.
Land.
Let me ask you a better question. Suppose for the moment a civilization did make itself available to Earth. And the civilization has technology, and it says, we will give you the technology for free so you can harness energy without destroying your planet. What would the planet do and say?
Sounds like you're trying to take away my liberty.
Yes! Yes, right there!
I'm going to grab my AK-47 and challenge this. Yeah, I don't know. It's a terrifying moment in the world, right? We're in a situation where the world needs to work together more than ever, especially to tackle this pandemic. But when it comes to climate change, when it comes to global economic inequality, these are all issues that extend beyond borders. I know people are big fans of borders and putting up walls around countries, but when you have millions of people migrating because of climate change or resource changing situations, we need something like, yes, if you're out there and you're listening to us, come and help us out a little bit.
Wait,
obviously, the people that are
I want you to answer that, and I want you to think really hard about that, because think of how we function on this planet. Competition. Everybody's at each other's throats, armed to the teeth. We're willing to spend $1 trillion on weapons while letting these people, for the most part, live on the street. And you have another civilization. Will we immediately think they're trying to get something out of us just by virtue of being
I don't know who you mean by we, though. That's the question, right? Like, obviously, we have an incredible system of international trade, of cultural exchange. People are able to travel around. There's an incredible amount of interconnectedness taking place, and people are obviously working together. We're not just simply at wars as much as people are closing themselves in. So yeah, I think anybody with power, the billionaire class and the 100 million wealthiest people on this planet, are going to rise up and get really angry, and they're going to pull along with tens of millions of people that just follow whatever they say because they've been conditioned to believe that. I think overall, though, given the situation, I think the global masses would work together in favor of it. I'm just going to put that out there because I want to be hopeful. I want to be hopeful. I don't really want to die by alien attack or people trying to kill aliens. And so I'm going to be hopeful and say people wrap their heads around it and work together. Because why not? Why not be a little hopeful on a day like today, Jim? Well, what do you think? I don't even know what it looks like. Is there like a grand announcement where they gathered everybody on television and they translate it simultaneously into 400 different languages and let everyone know what the deal is?
I think any civilization that cares about our civilization would never contact our civilization. I don't know how it works. You have all of these countries around the world. All of these countries are working for their own idea of domination. And then you add in an X factor of something that says, hey, we have technology. Maybe you don't even see their face, but hey, we have technology that'll help your planet. Now, I think Earth would freak out. I think a lot of people on the planet would freak out. And whether or not they're gifting it or not, the military people would be like, president, we can't trust them. They would say this is maybe some device that kills everybody on the planet. all of those things would be like, it would be such chaos just from where we are, because we don't have a united planet in the way that we think in this kind of like ideological way. We might have people shoot missiles up. Do countries try to cut side deals? Like, do countries start
what's been the response so far after these latest revelations of these UFOs?
People have been flipping out, like, not in a positive way. They're like, "Oh my God, aliens!" And then one of the guys was like, "I believe in aliens. Prove me wrong." Because at this point, they understand that from the standpoint of people who are skeptical, well, the evidence is on the side of people who kept saying that's something there. And by the way, Japan drew up new UFO procedures based on the Pentagon releasing this information, because Japan's thought was they wouldn't be releasing it if it's not real, and so maybe we need to do something about that. In which case, Japan, as a nation, drew up a new response. It's fascinating, right? But at the same token, it's somewhat terrifying.
But a lot of people like myself is just like, nah. I don't know. I guess I don't think the majority of people aren't freaking out. There's a small subset of people who actually care about this stuff. And it's people like you that report on this a year ago but aren't listened to. And so it would be really interesting. Like, what is it? I mean, is it like contact with giant orbs in 8 different places kind of settled down? Is it actual non-human looking creatures running around? Is it UFOs that we've seen so far doing like low-level flyovers and they're dropping candy to people? I mean, it is just kind of really
telepathic contact.
All the hypotheticals.
Or telepathic contact.
That can already be happening.
Right, that's my point. We're making assumptions that we engage entirely in its kind of communicative way, but we have no idea. I mean, like, your consciousness may be not necessarily in your head, and it may be something outside of you, in which case you may have contact in a way that we don't necessarily think about in physical terms. Like, it's not that straightforward, right? It's hard to process how that looks. So
yeah. And for all we know, Earth could be the alien planet, and we're already here.
Wouldn't that be weird?
Well, we've gone down the rabbit hole too far. I think we've revealed way too much. Let's get out of here and take a quick break. One last break here before we close out the show with a few more stories that we didn't want you to miss. You're listening to Political Misfits. That was our weekly Revelation segment here on Radio Sputnik. We're live in D.C. We're back right after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas, closing out the day for us here. Stay with Radio Sputnik, brand new broadcasting throughout the rest of the afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are listening in the world. A few more stories here, Jamarl. I'll let you pick here in Section 8. We got basketball goals, British kissing, or private payrolls. Basketball goals, British kissing, or private payroll.
Let's go with British kissing. I like a couple Brits.
It was a play on French kissing here, so that's as witty as I was getting today. But the British folks are going to kiss no matter what, Jamarl. Scientists, they are people too in our next story. Professor Neil Ferguson, one of the architects of the UK government stay-at-home strategy and a prominent member of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, which has been guiding the UK's coronavirus response, stepped down yesterday after reports that his married lover visited him twice at his home, a blatant violation of the guidelines he helped create. The Telegraph newspaper broke the story and described the woman as his lover, saying she lives in another house with her husband and children. Ferguson gave a statement to CNN saying he made, quote, an error in judgment and took the wrong course of action, but said he, quote, acted in the belief that I was immune having tested positive for coronavirus and completely isolated myself for almost 2 weeks after developing symptoms. So he once actually had COVID, but saying he's immune now, so it was okay for him to do some British kissing.
He doesn't know that, by the way.
He doesn't know that.
Well, one of the things that came up in the first reporting that I didn't get the opportunity to hit that part, was the coronavirus has mutated. It's mutated in so many ways that the version that initially started, let's say in China, is the one that's ravaging, is not the one that's ravaging the United States and the EU. So the version that he has, the paper was very explicit. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have immunity for the coronavirus, because the one that's been taking over is the one that's essentially spreading now. He could be reinfected.
Yeah, or the even non-mutated version, we simply don't know the science on the virus.
Exactly.
It's such a new virus that in a year from now, your basic immunity could break away. But don't tell that to another Brit here. We got another story from the UK. Scotland's now former chief medical officer, Catherine Calderwood, resigned from that position last month after she was caught by a local newspaper near her family's second home, far from the official Edinburgh address she was supposed to be staying at. She was given a formal police warning for leaving her home without proper excuse. Jamal, I'm very lucky. I have a great wife to hang out with. I have enough space and light at my home to feel safe and sane. So hard for me to make judgments here. I will say meeting up with just one person, feels a lot better than, I don't know, going to a rally with hundreds of others and screaming in the face of police officers in Michigan.
Yeah, that's not fun, right? That doesn't do it for me. I remember I showed that video where all of those protesters was like screaming in the face of those cops, and the cops were just standing there so placid, like nothing was going on. And it's like, that's not fun. That's not a good time. And do I really feel this revved up about trying to reopen the economy with all of these, like this stuff was AstroTurf though. Some of this was AstroTurf. I can say some of it.
Some of it. Jamal, in other news, let me tell you about this basketball goal one, just because I think it's funny and I want to make fun of the New York Times. But in case you weren't convinced, journalists were already huge nerds. The New York Times has a photo on its front page referring to a basketball goal, an item of sports equipment I have never heard of. There are Times ran a story about how a lot of NBA players don't actually have hoops at home or courts they can practice on now that things have been closed down, and used a photo with the story of a Miami Heat player shooting in his driveway that was captioned thus: Miami Heat center Myers Leonard practiced in his driveway in Miami Beach on Saturday on a basketball goal given to him by teammate Jimmy Butler. I'm a peace-loving person, and even I want to give this caption writer a swirly, Jamal. Live in the world. I guess you don't have to know sports, but you think you would just at least have like some sense of it all. And these people don't realize how out of touch. The New York Times is supposed to be the paper on record. And This is a paper that brought to you the Russiagate story for years on end, talking about how great they were and how they were going to cover it from a bipartisan view. And the Washington Post didn't even pretend to be bipartisan. They were pretty explicit early on that they were going right at Trump and we're going to push this Russiagate narrative. But then, Jamal, you go and talk to people across the country and nobody cares about Russiagate. Nobody is talking about the New York Times. Nobody thinks that these people actually speak for them. But yet this is held up as the record of paper of the United States, but they're incredibly out of touch.
Well, they're the paper of record for a certain class of the United States. There's never a United States per se. It's always factions of certain things, even though they talk about it in those terms. There is a group of people who love the New York Times. I even like the New York Times. Well, at the very least, I use it for the stories. But there is a group of people who follow that. But if you're talking about most people who are, just working and trying to make ends meet, and no, they're doing other things. They're trying to make their lives.
Yeah. And it speaks to that divide. I mean, I think that's a great point you make, is like it is the paper record for some classes. And then there are tens of millions of people that just watch sports. I mean, 100 million some people watch the Super Bowl. Tens of millions of people watch the NBA Finals. People are checked out from politics. And I don't know, Jamal. I guess I don't know. Should there be some onerous on reporters to meet people where they are and maybe like not just be this classist consortium of bad news that points to only a certain worldview, or should they actually be required to like go out and talk to people? And even we saw, I guess, the story we covered a little bit at the start of our run here on Political Misfits back a few months ago, was how the New York Times, NPR, CBS, all these different big outlets did the exact same story on Sputnik being in Kansas City. And they interviewed like the exact same person. They all did the exact same show. And so it just shows like these people don't care about anyone beyond themselves. It's one narrow message that they find the need to repeat over and over again. And that drives me nuts, Jamal. It's just it's a non-educational way towards our journalism, and that's what we're supposed to fight and protect with the very First Amendment of this country.
Yeah, it is. And meeting people where they are is interesting.
But
Yeah, I mean, in order to meet somebody where they are, I mean, you're in a situation of, I mean, that is by definition a change of class. Like, if you're talking to people who are, let's say, functioning, let's say, in the media space, well, that's one class. You have people in the business space. Okay, that's one class. But if you're talking about the needs and concerns of people who are in a different class bracket, well, you're getting into issues of paying rent, you're getting issues of poverty, you're getting those aren't things that I think they necessarily care about. I mean, that's not where their mindset is. That's a different paper. You know what I mean? I don't think we can get away with it. Let's go to the PV story, the Project Veritas story. Bob?
Yeah, I think it's a story breaking here. Project Veritas is looking to expose a fake story that CBS had set up, which they had mentioned. Jamar, hopefully you have the script there in front of you. My internet is down here in the time of COVID-19, and I'm unable to give the full depth of the story. I just saw it. I saw it before it went online here today.
No worries. I got you. So let's see. Project Veritas. Right, it's pretty funny. CBS. Okay, here we are. Right here. So Project Veritas, the Gotcha undercover investigative journalism project, has been accused of taking some of the scoops, has a new one. It's claiming that CBS program, CBS This Morning, aired footage from a Michigan COVID-19 testing site showing long lines that faked by medical staff to give the news program the images that they wanted. Project Veritas report includes quotes from insiders who worked at the facility, both named and anonymous, who spoke of being instructed to pull their own cars into the line to make it appear longer. Oh, that's awesome. That's horrible. CBS said in a statement that it had nothing to do with any staging of the facility, but dropped the bombshell that the hospital itself, Sherry Health, had just informed them that, quote unquote, one of their chief officers told them at least one staffer to get into the testing line along with the real patients. The network said they did not have any knowledge of this until after the segment aired on Friday. They also said that the actions did not prevent any actual patients from being tested. The network said, "We take the accuracy of our reporting very seriously, and we are removing the Sherry Health portion from the piece." CBS has cut the footage from the piece, which basically boils down to say, yes, they were correct, and saying that we fudged the story in some way. Now, the thing is, they didn't fudge the story in any real terms. I guess it's trying to make the optics look worse. But CBS is saying they didn't have anything to do with it, and apparently the healthcare facility did. So, weird, but here we are. Here we are, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who to believe in this situation, but it doesn't look good. And there was a story, I was working with a project here once, and the Washington Post was covering the person that I was supporting at the time, and I didn't know the truth at the time. And basically, we were talking about how this man got gentrified out of his barbecue shop, but he was still trying to train local residents on how to get jobs in the food industry. And so there was this story about a black person gentrified out of their small business because they couldn't keep up with the rents and they got kicked out. Well, it turned out basically the person wasn't paying rents. He was just withholding the money, and the church was charging him next to nothing. And the reporter in the Washington Post front page of the local section writes all this up, and I ask him later, I go, "Did you know about that?" He goes, "Yeah, I saw the court records, but my editors were pushing the feel-good story, and we had to run with that." And that's what we constantly find in journalism, Jamal. These journalists go out to tell the story that they've been told to go tell, and they'll basically allow for things to be set up in a certain way. They'll tell stories in a certain way that aren't completely accurate. And CBS, once again, all of its coverage, as we know, has been a big nothing burger. It's been swayed against Bernie Sanders. They've had people that they've silenced and their reporters. Yet again, I don't want to uphold James O'Keefe from Project Veritas, but when they come back with information like this, it looks pretty damning. Jamal, we are out of time here with Political Misfits for Wednesday, May 6th. A big shout out to our guests, Danny Haifung and Kimberlyn Carter. Thank you, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre Ansall, and the entire Sputnik News team for keeping us live and going. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, I absolutely appreciate you all coming to the show as always. This is the after show. There's always the after show. Now, let's see. We have some super chats, so let's respond to those. Mercedes Cali. Facepalm. I just took care of COVID patient for 14 hours. It seems like it's spiking in California. Not just California, it's also going to be spiking in New York and many of these other states like Texas that are opening up their economies early, Georgia included. Charles Calvin, Bernie campaign infiltrated, COINTELPRO never ended. Charles Calvin, we demanded a progressive to replace Biden at the convention. You can do that. You can do that. Whether they will allow that or not, that's the secondary question. Now, here's the thing. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I said it on the show and the woman didn't really have a response. The only way, Snort, I'm trying to find your comment and it's hiding it. The only way of getting anything accomplished in the political space is to pull yourself from the party. And I don't mean that in this kind of just, okay, now I'm no longer a Democrat. I mean this in the strict sense of I don't identify with that party. I identify with these policies. There's a difference between those things. And in my identification with these policies, if the person accepts my policies and there are no red lines, you get my support. If the person doesn't, then they don't. It's an automatic decision, a yay or nay, based on whether or not the individual or the group is going to accept your policy positions. If you have 10 million people standing on the side saying that, you will get your Medicare for all. You have so many people that run to the Democratic Party because for the longest time, 40 years, in their heads, the only way to do politics is to flip from one to the other, and you feel like you gotta vote. Not voting sometimes, especially when it's intentional, with a large number of people, is a vote. And when that intentional non-vote gets to the point where it can force a party to lose, you gain leverage in the political space. It's not that you want to do that. All things being equal, you would prefer to have an affirmative argument for a candidate, but there is something to be said about putting standards down to prevent a party from continuously moving further and further to the right. I would point to you for the last 40 years, that is literally what has taken place. I don't know how to get that across. And, people have this kind of, every time there's an election, this real narrow focus. This shallow, narrow focus of just, all right, I need to focus on this very specific election now. Missing the point that over the context of time, that narrow focus allows you to move further and further to the right because you're only looking at the narrow focus in that particular moment, not what's taking place from where they were and where you were on the political map to where you are now, where political figures take more and more cash and get worse and worse each year. You have the one concentration camp less idea. And then you find yourself in 20 years that there are 20 additional concentration camps. But hey, there are 2 less now. What happened? It's because they got more onerous. And you kept looking at this as a relative issue, never at any point realizing that sometimes it is better for the party to lose in order to set a standard that you are not willing to go beyond. Right now, you have a man accused of rape and who can't articulate words in a sentence. And that's the guy who they're giving you, who is out of sync with all of the policies that basically the Democratic base wanted. Just because they thought he was more electable. They thought that's all they could get. And the sad part is what they're considered to be more electable is just what they consider to be normal. Al Gore lost. Hillary Clinton lost. John Kerry lost. Joe Biden is just the same figure. The radical in the race was Obama. He won. The radical in this race is Sanders. Sanders matches up better with with Donald Trump. But the catch here is the public itself is conditioned to believe that Joe Biden is the norm. And it burns me. Joe Biden went around lying about civil rights and nobody called him on it. Oh, that burns me. That hurts. Snort. British kissing. Yes, Snort. That was one of those. British kissing. Marcus Will, does the Democratic Party care about people not voting? So yes and no. 50% of the public doesn't vote. And the lower the vote tallies, the less likely, the lower the people who are voting, meaning the lower the vote totals, the less likely they are to win. If you get a situation where a large number of people are organized, just even from the standpoint of all of these people are saying, this is what we want, and we are not participating without it, then that party either burns or changes. I don't care which. I'm done. I'm not playing this anymore. So at that point, it's up to them. But it's also up to us to have that organization to get that much more concise, so we will become something that has some kind of neural center and can correspond and interact with one another. Until that happens, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. Until that happens, the politics thing, one or two people who get into political space is not going to be able to enforce the change. It literally will take something outside of both parties. I don't care what their political persuasion is. Do you agree with these policies? And if they say yes, join the board. We can come up with a core later, but at the very least, we should agree we are not voting for X and be able to get that across in mass. Like, share, and subscribe.